presentation. I want to say, no.
Should be in the, whatever it is, that Dropbox, I think.
All right, I don't have that, but I can find our person who will. Can you do it on your computer? There's a way to split screen your thing on Skype? Or that might be
Yes, somebody will have to tell me how to do that, because I don't know how.
I think there's an option that says sharing screen, sharing.
Okay, so where do I find the
option that says sharing screen? Did you hear that?
Yeah. Okay, let me see if I can find that. Would that be under like tools or something? Options? Let's have a look. Sharing screen, I don't see it there. General settings. Change your picture, no. Okay, no, I don't see it there. Let me look around a bit here. Sharing screen. Okay, a split window view. Does that sound?
Yes. Yes.
Sound right? Okay, let me see. Yeah, why doesn't it split? Well, let me see. Let me bring up. Yeah, no, I don't know how to do this.
All right.
Jason, what about the Dropbox right in that symbol right below your?
Yeah, we didn't put it in a Dropbox though, and we can do this. All right. We are in room. Somebody remind me. SW. Okay, Thursday 2. Okay, Larry. I think maybe we have this interpretation.
There we go. Cool.
Here we go.
Okay, perfect. I can even see it. Great.
Let me see if I can make it. You know what? We'll try to get it right, just right.
That's good enough.
That's good enough?
Yeah, looks good. Looks very good.
Well, I'm ahead. Hang on to. I've heard that one before. Give me just
back up there. It was good there.
Okay, let me click it back then. Hold on. Sorry, guys. Here, it's coming back. Don't worry. As ever, I should have followed Christian's advice. Okay, here we go. Loman PDF. Okay. You want me to just sit here and you can tell me when to click it?
That sounds good, yeah, if you don't mind.
All right.
Okay, cool. I'll just.
No. It's just this. All right.
Yeah, if you could.
All right.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, this isn't like a let me mark my time down here. This isn't like a finished paper or a finished presentation. It's more like a set of 3 topics that I've been thinking about for maybe 30 years or so, just in the course of my activist work. And yeah, pretty soon I'm hoping to have a chance to get down to writing about some of this stuff. But anyway, as of now, it's just some topics and some questions. So could you go on to the next one?
No?
It's a different presentation.
Sorry about that. Wait, maybe we just go. Oh, we just go down. Okay. Sorry about that. There we go.
Yeah, the first topic I just like to throw out, and really I'm one of the reasons I'm happy to present here is I'm hoping that maybe some other people have thought about some of these things and can give me some reactions and some help. So please. Actually, at any time, please interrupt me because I really like to throw some of this stuff out. Yeah, the first thing that really strikes me as an important topic that isn't actually talked that much about in Marxist circles is the fact that interpretation and translation is the core of the work that creates capitalist value. I mean, you might not think that's very interesting because it's at the core of everything that human beings do. I think it's something that often gets overlooked. Could you put the next one, please? Yeah, I think one of the simplest examples of the fact that interpretation and translation are work is just that every minute of every day in our interaction with other people, and that includes our interaction with machines and people, is we're constantly having to solve these problems of, do we keep meaning constant, or do we keep belief constant? Do we assume that other people have the same beliefs we have, or do we assume that we heard their words right and maybe their beliefs are different? And there's this constant trade-off. And I guess another way of putting this is that translation and interpretation are is a power-laden political activity, and that's prior to word meaning and belief. And that goes completely contrary to the common sense that we've been taught since Descartes, which is that, the meanings are fixed there in the heads, or the meanings are fixed there in the cultures, and all we got to do is decode it in a sort of automatic way. Next one, please. And I think it's often not appreciated to what extent that this fact that interpretation is work, is actual work, that's concealed by this, I think, historical process of fetishization of meaning and the fetishization of belief, which is, I think it's a historical product. The philosopher W.V.O. Quine, who was Davidson's teacher, called it the idea, and I don't mean to quote Quine as a sort of political figure, because he unlike Davidson, he was extremely right wing, and I'm sure he would have no sympathy at all for the purposes the way that I'm using his work. But anyway, he called it the idea, this fetishization of meaning as something fixed, which is not actually created through practice, through not only intercultural practice, but intracultural practice. Next one, please. And I think one of the people who's really followed through on this in a historical way is the historian and literary scholar Lydia Liu, who actually does these very concrete, exhaustively concrete sort of studies of colonialism as they involve China, and actually when these fetishistic equivalences between meaning of one word and the meaning of another word are created, she looks at that as a historical process in a lot of specific detail with a lot of specific examples. Next one, please. One of the reasons that I think it's important to talk about interpretation and translation as a work is because we see the same kinds of processes and the same kinds of problems for capital arising as arise with kinds of work which are characterized in another way. I mean, there's this drive for mechanization of interpretive work, just as in the 19th century there was this drive for the mechanization of factory work or manufacturing work, as Marx described it. And in fact, it goes back. If you talk about dictionaries, in a sense, dictionary, which is a way of sort of fixing these fetishistic equivalences between the meaning of a word in one language and another language. I mean, of course, that goes back way, well, basically to the beginnings of the capitalist era. But I would argue that that's sort of a kind of proto-mechanization. And of course, it's been recently followed up and accelerated hugely with things like Google Translate, and including the recent, I think within the last couple of years, this incredible sort of multiplication of Google Translate skills in terms of the use of neural nets, which is again a very sophisticated kind of mechanization. And of course, I mean, the same questions and contradictions arise here. I mean, it's in a sense, this is sort of increasing the organic content of capital. So, where is this leading, and what relation is the fresh living interpretive labor? What relation does that have with the mechanization? I mean, one of the dilemmas of mechanization is, you've always got to supplement that with more living human labor in order to keep your processes going. And probably some people would deny that that's happening with interpretive labor. They would say, oh no, the Google Translate is actually replacing living human labor. And I just want to raise that question, because I think it's not something that people are talking about enough, especially given these recent revolutions in mechanization of interpretive labor. Next one, please. Yeah, I mean, and another issue we shouldn't forget, and here I'm referring to David Graeber up there at the top. I'm not sure he'd like that photograph. And I think his most recent book, he's one of the few people I've run across who actually uses the word interpretive labor. I mean, he's talking about it. He's looking at it from a slightly different angle, and he's talking about how he just explores this fact that that dominant groups actually have to do a lot less interpretive labor just in order to get along because of their reliance on structural violence and so forth. Whereas, people in a restaurant kitchen, which is one of the examples he uses, constantly having to work really hard at interpreting what the boss is thinking and nurturing the boss's illusions about this and that, while simultaneously, solving the problems which will prevent the boss from coming down on them and so forth. So that kind of interpretive labor is massive, in the part of the working class. At the same time, it's completely unrecognized and unvalued. Whereas other kinds of interpretive labor, like the interpretive labor of your Wall Street quants, is hugely valued. And this is done by Marxists as well as by non-Marxists who can talk about cognitive labor as being something new, which this new educated class is doing. And I think that's another issue that needs to be explored more. Next one, please. Yeah, well, I mean, and of course, interpretive skills themselves. There's this dual valuation where the contribution of especially women to the development of interpretive skills between the ages of 0 and 5, roughly, is completely devalued and unrecognized. But of course, exploited by capital, whereas the interpretive skills, which are supposedly imparted in MBA programs and so forth, are hugely exalted and well paid. Next, please. And this is just a footnote, but just on the issue of mechanization. I mean, I think it's quite important to look at some of the historical parallels with the way the capitalist state in the past has looked toward the mechanization of interpretive labor and the way that political figures today are looking at the mechanization of interpretive labor. I mean, on the left we have the figure of Antonio Nebrija, the sort of one of the inventors of dictionaries and grammars, who tried to fix this a sort of Spanish language, proto-Spanish language, as an instrument of state, very consciously in the service of Ferdinand and Isabella. And then today we have this, the figure on the top right is Robert. Probably a lot of you know him. He's one of the billionaire supporters of Trump. And I don't think it's coincidental, both that he has served as an intermediary between people like Trump and these data mining firms like Cambridge Analytica, and also people like Nigel Farage in the UK, who's a sort of counterpart of Trump over here. And he's played this big role as an intermediary and supporter of these right-wing political figures. But I don't think it's a coincidence that he himself is actually one of the pioneers of machine translation. And one of his sort of big contributions to the rise of the far right in countries like the US and the UK is he's really put together what machine translation has turned into. This mechanized interpretation by which there's probably several large firms that as of now understand me better than I understand myself in many respects, because they're able to interpret all of my online behavior. They're interpreting everything they know about me, and they're number crunching it. And in a sense, I freely admit they probably know me a lot better than I know myself in some ways. And of course, this is used in well-known ways in the political campaigns for targeting voter populations and so forth. And this has been very important for Trump and Farage and many others. That's just a footnote. Next. Yeah, the second issue I'd just like to sort of throw out is that, interpretation and translation is at the core of everyday work, but it's also at the core of class struggle, as you might expect. I mean, work itself is at the core of class struggle and anti-colonialist struggle. Next. And here again, I'd like to refer to Lydia Liu, who looks at the colonialist and anti-colonialist struggle struggle in light of this in several books. Next, please. Yeah, and this is for some of you who are baffled by what the hell I'm talking about. This might help. This might help sort of make it a little bit more concrete. At the top is a Thai word ngan, which is usually translated in a trifurcated way as indicated by those lines. So you have equivalences between ngan and ceremony or party. Sometimes it means that, and you have it's also usually translated as work, and typically that's interpreted as capitalist work by English speakers. And then there's also a word which is derived from ngan, which is used to refer to energy, meaning thermodynamic energy. And those three lines, going down, that sort of indicates the usual dictionary, the usual interpreter's way of dealing with this word in intercultural contexts. And I think it's useful to think of each of those lines as a line of fetishization. So in other words, you're fixing equivalences between ngan and three different things, but you're separating them in the English so that you're reproducing this standard capitalist trichotomy or dichotomy between things which are sort of like folklore on the left, ngan means folklore and some kind, and then you have the work in the middle, which is usually capitalist work, like nganjan there is like hired labor. Rangan is like labor in a capitalist sense. Sapap Rangan is labor union. And then you have energy over there. And I mean, the point is that politically, the translation of ngan is indeterminate. It doesn't fall into these three categories necessarily, but that's just a political. That's the way, because of the power relations between English and Thai and English and Thai speakers. That's the way that things have been trichotomized. And next, please. But just as a thought experiment, if you sort of trouble that and you disturb that fetishized trichotomy where you have the establishing these equivalences and establish other equivalences according to another thing, another set of assumptions, you get a completely different set of translations, which actually are much more friendly to an anti-capitalist or a commons or a capitalist critical perspective. Next, please. And this is just another very simple and concrete example. It's just on my mind because I was in Ecuador a couple of months ago, and we actually had this encounter with a group of international activists and scholars. We were visiting a particular canton where they're engaged in quite a struggle with the national government over extraction and over labor, and it's an area where there's been a lot of out-migration to Europe and so forth. And at one point, somebody asked the lady in the middle, Mama Juana, how do you see development? What do you see development as? And interestingly, she refused that translation. She said, we don't have that word in Quechua. She knew Spanish. The conversation was in Spanish. She knew exactly what the question was, but she refused the translation. And she said, no, we can't talk this way. We can't start a conversation this way. And I think that was a political move, which was, not denying the value of translation, but just saying that we have to choose our translation. Next, please. Yeah, the third thing is just also interpretation translation is at the core of movement building, not only class struggle and anti-colonial struggle, but sort of internal movement building. And this is sort of something that I've especially been thinking about over the last 30 years, because I run into it all the time. Next, please. And Boaventura de Sousa Santos puts it very well. He says, translation is not a technique; it's a political and dialogical work. And this is something I think, not only Marxist scholars are neglecting the issue of translation and interpretation as work, not seeing it as work, but also, of course, activists themselves, tend to fall into this pattern of instant translation, where you go with the fetishized lines, which are, creating these equivalences. Next, please. E.P. Thompson, I think, was well aware of the issue when he was talking about the, very interesting interactions that were taking place between the rising language of industrial capitalism and the language of the commons. Next, please. Yeah, and this is just the final bit. I mean, bringing it up to date a bit. I mean, I think these are practical issues which are arising in our attempts to bring different movements together and to get some kind of more interesting dialogue going on between movements. And some of the of course this involves translation. It involves what I hope is a kind of slow translation, but nevertheless it starts out and continues with certain kinds of equivalences, just as capitalist translation relies on certain kinds of equivalences. And some of the, Lydia Liu calls them hypothetical, all equivalents, such equivalences are hypothetical equivalences, and historical and political. These are some of the ones that are taking place, I think, between different movements in, there's a Latin American bias here, movements in Latin America and movements in Asia, Africa, and Europe. And one of the sort of problematic